Welcome to the C.S. Joseph podcast. I'm your host, C.S. Joseph. That being said, this is a new lecture series. Welcome. This is going to be a very different season because this is actually season 7, but this is season 7 part 2. Therefore, this is technically season 7, episode 17. Okay? And this is the first time that we're going to be talking about Enneagram-related content. And having the opportunity to talk about Enneagram, it's something that many of us have been waiting for a very, very long time. But in order for us and the team here at or within the CSJ community to actually be able to present to the community our version of the Enneagram, we need to actually lay down the foundation ahead of time. That way we're all on the same page. We actually understand what is actually going on. A lot of people don't actually realize that the Enneagram itself is based on a combination of Jungian analytical psychology, naturally, but also on a concept known as the 7 deadly sins. And the 7 deadly sins, which is a very Catholic concept. And, for example, in the late 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great reduced the list to 7 deadly sins, to 7 items, and basically combines a bunch of them. And however, the problem is that we find that is entirely inaccurate. And due to that little inaccuracy, because yes, I'm literally saying that C.S. Joseph disagrees with Pope Gregory the Great at this point, yeah, I just do. And I totally understand, from their perspective, why Pope Gregory did what he did to simplify certain things. But also, it was to reduce attack surface against the Catholic Church in terms of the Catholic Church being criticized for certain things. And certain consolidations and concessions were made by Pope Gregory the Great in order to conceal certain things about the Church's behavior in the eyes of its parishioners and its subjects, basically, to help secure the political power and the social power of the Church itself. These decisions were made. At least that's my theory, and honestly, I'm sticking to it. But the 7 deadly sins at a base level is the foundation for the Enneagram and combined with Jungian analytical psychology. However, that has led to an incompleteness of the Enneagram, and this is why I maintain that the Enneagram literally is no different than the Zodiac. The Zodiac is also incomplete. I maintain there's actually 16 signs and not 12 signs. We just can't see the missing 4 signs because the Earth itself, where it's positioned within the Milky Way galaxy, is actually inside of the other 4 constellations, and those constellations are way too close for us to actually observe. It's kind of like, when you're actually looking out of your body with your eyes. It's not like you can turn your eyes around and look at yourself. You just can't. You can't really even perceive the point of origin. Someone else has to perceive the point of origin. This is one of the reasons why humanity has a hard time typing themselves, including myself. I couldn't type myself. I had to have a third party, an onlooker, an observer actually type me, because it's actually very difficult for people to know themselves. And it's so hilarious to me how, out of all the 16 types, ISTPs are the ones that claim that they know themselves the most when they really actually know themselves the least. It's hilarious. Thank you, SI Critic, for that. Thank you so much for that. And yet they're in complete denial that they even are forgetful as well. Thank you for that hilarity as well. I enjoy observing your ISTP hypocrisy, folks. It's my favorite thing in the world. And then, after I enjoy it, I make fun of it and mock it. It's great. Thank you for the ammunition. I love it. So, with all that, the Zodiac is incomplete, but in the same way or manner that the Zodiac is incomplete, guess what? So also is the Enneagram, because the 7 deadly sins is an incomplete model. So what we have done is that we've looked into the 7 deadly sins. We actually did a little bit more research to go along with that. And as part of our main disagreement with Pope Gregory the Great, we decided to take vainglory out and put it back so that it is part of the original 8 deadly sins before Pope Gregory the Great made his change. And imagine if you're being Pope Gregory the Great and they're selling indulgences to people and it's claiming, hey, if you give money to the church, that means you go to heaven, etc. Yeah, and then the church has all this gold, all these fine clothes, all these idols and icons that they have. That sounds pretty vainglory to me, but if they remove the term vainglory from the collective unconscious of their parishioners and or people, who worship under the Catholic flag, as a result of that, with vainglory removed from the list, people can't criticize the church for being vain, right? So it was really, really important to make sure that we added vainglory back. And then in doing so, we finally actually have a complete system for our own interpretation of the Enneagram, which is very, very key. And if you notice, like, because of the 8 deadly sins, you can actually apply cognitive functions, you can apply types directly to the deadly sins and actually come to a better, more complete understanding of what's actually going on. And this understanding is absolutely critical if you guys, when you guys actually start to use our version of the Enneagram, which will come later, and also to help you understand how the temples actually work and how they interact with one another, that kind of thing. That's mega important. But we're kind of just breaking down what we talked about in Season 18, Cognitive Mechanics, about the 4 temples and actually what makes the temples tick. Because the temples, or the temple theory within Jungian analytical psychology, is absolutely necessary in order to even have a complete understanding of the Enneagram to begin with. But then you have to also understand the temples, and to do that you need to understand specifically the deadly sins, the living virtues, and ultimately the functional virtues of each of the 4 temples. All of these things matter, okay? And that sounds like a lot of information. Yes, it is. That's why we've dedicated the next 9 episodes, including this one. This is the first of 9 in terms of Season 7, Part 2, starting with Episode 17, and we're going to be going through 9 episodes, including this one, to actually explore those things so that you folks have a better understanding. Now that we've been able to go through our nomenclature, our labels, and lots of debate, months and months of debate, between myself, Chris Taylor, John Bodine, Robert Potts, and anyone else who has contributed to this project. There's also people on the Discord server that I also like to thank for their discussions with Chris Taylor and others relating to the temples. Those discussions have been very helpful, and we've been able to refine the temple theory in a way where it's actually presentable, digestible, it makes sense, and then we're able to go at this level of the deadly sins. And then now, after we have all this huge foundation poured, then guess what? We're going to be applying the temples themselves as a new vector to be utilized in Ucha to help you navigate the type grid. And the next step after that, we're going to be releasing a test that's going to be a companion test alongside Ucha that will be utilized to help you determine your cognitive focus, right? Because you can use the deadly sins to help identify your cognitive focus, and that will be in effect the CSJ community's version of the Enneagram, which will be completely accurate and pretty dope. So we're going to be adding that to Ucha as well. So this is great because you're going to get an additional vector with which you'll be able to navigate the type grid and make it more accurate and easier for you to type people. And you're also going to be getting the CSJ community's version of the Enneagram to help you identify via our test people's cognitive focus, including your own. So that's ultimately where we're going with this. But really, in order for us to get there, we need to make sure that we're putting in the work. And that's one of the reasons why we're doing the new 5 episodes to replace the temple episodes in Season 18 and to continue on with Season 18 from there. And then we're also going to be adding in these 9 episodes to Season 7, Part 2. That way the rest of the audience can catch up. But it's going to be very slow. And if obviously, if they're going to want to have it all and be current on everything, they're going to want to be a member. But I think it's really important that Season 18 Cognitive Mechanics is actually made more available to everybody, because we are starting to notice, for example, concepts talked about within the Cognitive Mechanics season of Season 18. They're being talked about regularly on Facebook. They're being talked about regularly on Discord. And we're starting to notice that the audience is kind of having a different split in certain ideas and certain terminologies. And we're trying to make sure that we're keeping the audience healthy by having you all sharing the same terminology. And since cognitive mechanics as a season just basically exists as like the main primer of all of Jungian analytical psychology all in one place, we feel it's really necessary to make sure that we're going to be making that available. Let's actually talk about the 8 deadly sins. So let's list out the deadly sins that are there. There's the deadly sin of lust. There's the deadly sin of gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, pride, and vainglory. And vainglory is that one that Pope Gregory the Great removed in the 6th century, and then supposedly like he added it to pride, etc. But it's not really the same thing. They are completely different. And guess what, folks? The deadly sins are attached to each of the 16 types, or at least the 16 types are attached to deadly sins, because 2 of the 16 types has a primary deadly sin. Now, one of the reasons why we added this to season 7 is because obviously we were talking about virtues and vices. And those virtues and vices are a mixture of nature and nurture that would typically occur to each of the 16 types from a very colloquial perspective, and that's the first half of season 7. That's season 7 episodes 1 through 16. That's what that represents. Season 7 part 2 is a little bit different. We're going even deeper. We're going deeper at a deeper level of virtue and vice, but this time we're making it centered around the deadly sins, because each of the 16 types has a deadly sin. And deadly sins can be really, really bad, but they can also be really, really good, and we're going to be examining how that is the case in future episodes. Very important, very necessary. Like I said, we can't really come to a real understanding of the Enneagram and how to use the Enneagram, an accurate Enneagram, to actually determine people's cognitive focus without this. So that's kind of like, in effect, what's going on here, right? So again, just being informative. So, but let's actually, do a little refresher here about why deadly sins are important and what they're attached to. So remember the 4 temples, okay? So we have the soul temple, we have the heart temple, we have the mind temple, and we have the body temple, the 4 temples. And each temple has what we're calling a functional virtue. It's like it's something that each of the temples aspire to, and they can aspire to it in a positive way, and they can aspire to it in a negative way. It is a very neutral virtue. It is a neutral virtue that's attached to each of the temples. And the functional virtue of the soul temple is character, and developing one's own character, or developing the character of other people. It's all about character. And it is the primary temple. You could think of it as like the ego temple for humanity, basically. It's also very abstract, and which is pretty awesome. And then the next temple, which is the heart temple, that too is an abstract temple as well. And the heart temple, its functional virtue is the virtue of passion, basically. It's all about passion. That can be a good thing. That can be a bad thing as well. We get, us in the heart temple, we can get very passionate about things, as you folks are very aware of when it comes to C.S. Joseph losing his mind on a live stream or in front of the camera as his head just gets removed from his body and starts floating up into space, spinning rapidly with being all red and steam going everywhere, potentially suffocating or choking everyone in the room. Who knows? And I guess that's kind of why we have, a Harry Potter wand from time to time, although that has been retired, sadly. And I don't know if it's sad, though. But anyway, it just happens. And sometimes we need to be brought down to earth, and that's why we're explaining the functional virtues in this way. But it's all about passion to the heart temple. And honestly, if I don't have passion in my life, there's no way that I can actually do anything or even be motivated to do anything in my life without having some kind of passion. Like, I have a lot of passion towards my work, a lot of passion towards the people in my life. I take these things very seriously, and if there's no passion, I'm just honestly completely uninterested. Kind of like how STPs, for some reason, can just decide to have sexual relations without any passion, and then they behave like machines in the bedroom, and honestly, it triggers the F out of me. Like, seriously, why? Gross. Like, literally gross. Y'all can enjoy yourselves being boring machines, but us over here in the Heart Temple, we're going to be super mega passionate and actually enjoy ourselves. So, okay, go be mechanical. You can go enjoy that. While us over here, we're going to be human. Nice. Anyway, so moving on to the Mind Temple. The functional virtue of the Mind Temple is ultimately learning, and then that learning can become teaching. Education is very central to the Mind Temple. It's very important. That's kind of like the direction that it's going. And then there is the Body Temple, which is in effect, if the Soul Temple is the ego of the four temples according for the purpose of humanity, then the Body Temple would be the super ego, basically. And its functional virtue is legacy, leaving something behind, creating a work of art or a work for them to be known for indefinitely, kind of like how the Great Pyramid of Giza is one such example of Body Temple legacy here on the earth. You know, the Seven Wonders of the World, that was also an example of legacy for the Body Temple, right? And psychologically, this is kind of where we are going and where we're like that entire direction, right? Now, remember that the temples themselves also have 4 of the 16 types attached to each temple as part of this sub-introduction, lol. So the character temple, also known as the soul temple, that is ENFP, INFJ, and then ISTJ, ESTP, right? And then my temple, the heart temple, that would be ENTP, ISFJ, INTJ, ESFP. We are the heart temple. And then there is the mind temple, which is the ESTJ, ISTP, ENFJ, INFP. And then the body temple, which would be ENTJ, ISFP, ESFJ, INTP, in no particular order. So, and if you notice, each of these 4 sets of the 16 types are actually equivalent to the 4 sides of the mind. The 4 sides of the mind, if like you have an ENFJ, well, they're part of the mind temple because they have ISTP, ESTJ, INFP in their head. Same thing for an INFP. They have the same 4 types in their head. Same thing for an ESTJ. They have the same 4 types in their head. And same for the ISTP. So all 4 of those types as egos have all of those 3 other types within their heads, and that's why they are a part of the mind temple, and that's why they are focused so much on learning and teaching and education, right? It's no different for the body temple. ENTJs, ISFPs, ESFJs, INTPs, they all have these other types within their head, within their 4 sides of the mind. Therefore, they have the same functional virtue of leaving a legacy behind, the body temple. And that's why they have an interesting relationship with death, but more on that later. So you have each of these 4 types that are attached to the 4 temples, and each of the 4 temples have these functional virtues: character, passion, learning, and legacy. Okay? Very important functional virtues, and these virtues can be expressed in positive and negative ways. Okay? And when it comes to discussing expression, while that is what happens, why are they expressed in positive and negative ways? And that is basically goes down to the deadly sins versus the living virtues, basically, at another layer deeper. Now, functional virtue is above deadly sin and living virtue because the functional virtue represents the entire temple itself, and what each of the 4 types attached to that temple are aspiring towards in a positive or negative way. Okay? Very important to know that distinction. I just want to make sure that there is a difference between functional virtue and living virtue. Living virtue is at a deeper level and is more attached to a deadly sin. It is not the same as a functional virtue, and a living virtue is more on the positive side, while the deadly sin is more on the negative side. That's not to say that there isn't some yin and yang equilibrium going there, where even deadly sins have positive traits and living virtues have negative traits. And we're going to be discussing each of those traits as well as we get into further episodes down in this lecture series for Season 7, Part 2, episodes 17 and beyond. So yeah, just trying to make sure that you folks understand that there is a very big difference between functional virtue, which is at a high level and representative of the entire temple, and it's both positive and negative. And then looking at the deadly sin level, you have living virtues attached, but that's a bit deeper within the temple itself. Okay? Very, very key. All right, so make sure you guys don't forget that. I'm very concerned about the audience forgetting about that, because it could lead to some potential confusion, and that's what I'm trying to avoid. Actually go back to the deadly sins, and let's actually assign the specific deadly sins and living virtues to each of the 16 types. All right, so this is really important. So let's go back to the soul temple, because the soul temple is basically the ego temple, and then yeah, that's really important. And then the heart temple is basically the unconscious. The mind temple is the subconscious, and the body temple is the superego, basically, of the humanity approach. At this very high macro level, etc. Although when we start talking about the actual mechanics in terms of the relationship between these temples, which are effectively almost like the four sides of the mind for all of humanity, etc., they actually interact with each other in a different way, but more on that later, and we'll actually be discussing that in depth in Season 18, Cognitive Mechanics. So that's another thing. But the soul temple has two deadly sins attached to it, and that is the deadly sin of wrath and the deadly sin of lust. Okay? Now, one thing about identifying deadly sins is that, and this is really important, if there's anything that you guys get out of this lecture, you get out of this episode, this is the one thing you need to really pay attention to right now. When you're looking at a person's quartet or their temple, quartet and temple are the same thing, which are the total four sides of their mind within their heads. You have their ego and their subconscious, and those two types, their ego and subconscious, are actually the same cognitive function stack. It's just that within the ego, and then you have the subconscious, the same functions, but it's just flipped on its end. It's just flipped upside down, basically, and that is called the anima and the animus, according to Carl Jung. If you want to learn more about the anima and the animus, I highly recommend reading Jung's book, Ion. Ion is the number one source out there, written source, for the four sides of the mind, and that is ultimately where the four sides of the mind theory came from, is Carl Jung's work as explained in the book Ion, specifically the first 5 chapters of that book. So if you want to actually learn more, go read that, okay? The rest of the book is more about metaphysics and expert intuition and consequences and future prophecy stuff according to Carl Jung, but the first 5 chapters are really heavily devoted to basically him getting to the point where he's realizing that there is 4 sides of the mind, and we've just gone even further and actually defined it out and kind of like broken it down for everyone as a result. But again, the soul temple has wrath and lust as its deadly sins. And now, but here's the kicker. Here's the most important thing that you need to take away from this lecture. Okay, so if you have an ego and a subconscious, the subconscious, the anima and animus is also another way of saying subconscious. The functions are flipped upside down, but they're in effect the same. So basically, the ego and the subconscious shares the same deadly sin. Okay. And then when you have someone who's cognitive focused towards their subconscious, it's like they have a double helping of the deadly sin. This is one of the ways that we're able to actually utilize our own Enneagram system to help identify cognitive focus, because if they have too much of a deadly sin, it's a lot easier to be like, oh, they're subconscious focused. And if they have a balance between 2 separate deadly sins within their soul, well, guess what? Or within their mind, guess what? Or the 4 sides of the mind, guess what? That means they are actually more likely shadow focused. All right. and that helps understand the variance. And in our version of the Enneagram, will actually be testing subconscious focus versus shadow focus. We're not really going to bother doing so-called ego focus or super ego focus. We're really not going to bother doing that because they're egos, okay? And the reason why that's important to make that distinction is because the egos themselves don't really often do so much from the focus point of view, because if anyone's more ego focused or super ego focused, that could be due to like brain injury, or it could actually be due to integration, and they're actually getting closer and closer to enlightenment. But when we're going to be discussing enlightenment, especially with Mr. Chris Taylor in the future, just because we reach enlightenment here on Earth, potentially within the four sides of our mind, guess what? There's even higher steps of enlightenment after that that would actually technically have to go beyond this lifetime. And if you guys have been paying attention to the Cutting Edge episodes recently, we did make a case as to how Jungian analytical psychology practically proves reincarnation. And also the Bible supports reincarnation too. You might want to check that out, especially Malachi chapter 4 verses 5 and 6, which is also, oddly enough, my life purpose, but it's also one of the areas where it proves, or at least supports, or at least the Bible is like, yeah, the Bible's like, oh yeah, bro, I'm pro reincarnation. You know what I'm saying? So you might want to pay attention to that. There's levels of enlightenment, okay? And we're going to be talking to Christ Taylor about that in a future episode. I believe, hopefully in the next Cutting Edge episode, we'll have him as a guest, and we'll be discussing reincarnation in a deeper manner. But the point is, the ego and the subconscious, those two types, they share the same deadly sin, and the shadow and the superego also share the same deadly sin within a person's head, within their four sides of their mind, within their temple, okay? They share the same deadly sin. So looking at the soul temple, the first set of types we have is the ENFP and the ISTJ. The ENFP is the first type in the sequence because guess what? It is the most abstract and is also the starter type. It is it's the most abstract of all the types, and the soul temple itself is abstract, and the ENFP is in effect the leader of the soul temple. Just like the ENTP is the leader of the heart temple. And the ESTJ is the leader of the mind temple, and the ENTJ is the leader of the body temple. Kind of interesting how that works. But yes, the ENFP is the first type in the sequence, and then ENFP's subconscious is the ISTJ, which means their deadly sin is the deadly sin of wrath. Haven't you guys ever noticed how they can get really angry all of a sudden? And then when you're looking at their living virtue is basically the opposite of wrath, which is absolution, which is 100% pure mercy. Which basically means they're trying to also absolve themselves of responsibility, is kind of how that can come off, how that living virtue can be negative or seen as negative later. But the deadly sin of wrath is attached to the ENFP and the ISTJ. Now looking at the other side, the other half of the soul temple, we have the ESTP and the INFJ. And their deadly sin is the deadly sin of lust. This is why out of all the 16 types, ESTPs and INFJs have the most sex out of everybody. This is why ESTPs have the biggest reputation for being absolute total hoes, when the reality of the situation is actually INFJs have much higher body counts than ESTPs ever do, even though ESTPs are the ones with the reputation. But regardless, out of all the 16, those two types have more sex than anybody else because of their deadly sin of lust. They have a really hard time keeping it in their pants. And we're actually going to be exploring why in 1 to 2 episodes from now, just so that everyone's aware as to how that works. And obviously the living virtue that is attached to that is chastity, because it is the opposite of lust. Now granted, I know that we have chastity for the ESTP virtue when we're looking at our virtue in vice model, which is still technically accurate. The thing is, though, is that from a temple point of view, from a four sides point of view, with their quartet of the 4 types in their head, chastity still applies. And this is where we're starting to actually define how some of the 16 types actually have a little bit of overlap with their virtues and their vices, because I know a lot of people within this community and within this audience have been asking questions over the years, especially relating to season 7, as to why certain types seem to be overlapping with the same virtues and vices. And basically, as a result of season 7 part 2, with this additional definition and this additional research and structuring of the temple theory within Jungian analytical psychology, I maintain we're actually going to be able to finally answer those questions concretely. So that's what we're doing. So the next temple we have is the heart temple. And the heart temple has the deadly sin of envy and the deadly sin of vainglory. Okay, and that can be like a big deal. And naturally, I'm an ENTP and the ISFJ is my subconscious, so those two types have the deadly sin of envy. I am the most envious person I know. I live and die by envy. I'm motivated by envy. I can't live without envy. It's just who I am. Envy is everything for me, and as much as I actually hate to admit it, I don't want to live without my envy. I want to make that very clear. I don't want to live without my deadly sin. And if you were to actually ask an ESTP or an INFJ about living without their deadly sin of lust, do you think they'll be able to? No. There's no way. If you really think about it, who out there is going to be willing to give up their deadly sin? That's why it's deadly. Because it's actually a part of their soul. It's actually a part of who they am. It is their nature. They can't be who they are without living with their deadly sin, living in their deadly sin, without being the avatar of their deadly sin. Because it's just really a part of it. And obviously the same goes for the living virtue. And the living virtue for the ENTP and the ISFJ type is compassion, which is in effect understanding the pain of someone's life despite what they have. And this is really important because, why am I here? Why is C.S. Joseph here? Why does he have this business? Why does he have this channel? It's really because of compassion. I don't want anyone else to live my past. I want to make sure to leave something for my children so that they can have a better future, because I maintain they're not really going to have a future, actually. So I'm hoping by doing this line of work that they will actually have a future as a result, when they learn these concepts themselves and apply it to their life. You see what I'm saying? The reality of the situation is that I'm here because of my living virtue, which is compassion. And it's so funny because in my life, I am punished by being envious, but I'm also punished for being compassionate. But more on that later. Okay? So let's talk about the other half of the heart temple, and that is the ESFP and INTJ, and their deadly sin is obviously vainglory. It is all about vainglory. It's all about looking good. It's all about having the accolades of success. Gotta have that jet ski, you know what I'm saying? Gotta have that super mega house with vaulted ceilings. Gosh, I remember my ex talking about how she had to have really high ceilings or else she just couldn't handle it, and I'm like, wow, you are so goddamn entitled. So entitled and incapable of actually being happy with very little. Me, I'm very content living out of my Subaru just fine, and it's super mega comfortable in there, okay? And I made it comfortable. I got this really dope mattress. I got this Milwaukee battery system, which is freaking amazing, with a 12-amp battery and the top-off inverter on it, which powers a fridge. The only thing that may bother me is either too much heat or not enough heat. Basically it's just managing hot and cold in the vehicle. But for the most part, I'm a happy camper, literally. You see what I'm saying? But when you talk about INTJs and ESFPs, no. No. They can't. Sometimes they just can't live without the finer things. You know what I'm saying? And here's an example in popular culture that represents vainglory perfectly. The show Keeping Up with the Kardashians. That is as vainglory as you can get. Okay, that's what that entire show is all about. It's all about vainglory and being vain. And ESFPs and INTJs are the most vain of all the types, and they don't want to live without their vanity. Trust me. Because let's be honest, they have this insane amount of boredom, and they also feel bad if they don't have the accolades of success. They don't want to feel bad about themselves, so they cover it up with vanity, basically. And their living virtue is obviously the opposite of vainglory, which is modesty. And honestly, finding a modest INTJ out there, especially a modest INTJ woman, is extremely hard. Same thing with ESFPs. They're not very modest. I actually, my ESFP stepfather-in-law, do you know how many trucks he owns? He owns a lot of trucks. He's got trucks. He's not rich, but he's got a lot of trucks. Okay? Vainglory. It's a thing. They like them some possessions, some nice possessions. You know, I remember my ex, she claimed that her wardrobe required many truckloads. Interesting how that works. Gotta love that heart temple, guys, you know. So yeah, envy and vainglory, compassion and modesty. Don't forget, guys, you know, just because like I'm an ENTP and that means my main deadly sin is envy, that doesn't mean I don't have vainglory too. I have an INTJ shadow. I have an ESFP superego. That means vainglory is still a problem for me. You see what I'm saying? In as much as envy is still a problem for INTJs and ESFPs. The same thing for the soul temple. You know, just because ENFPs and ISTJs have the deadly sin of wrath that's attached to their ego and their subconscious, that don't mean they don't struggle with lust. They absolutely do, because they have ESTP and INFJ in the shadow side of their quartet, or their, you know, their temple, you know, within their shadow and their superego. Don't forget that too. It's another really important point that you need to make sure you're taking away when considering this lecture. Okay, and then we have the mind temple. The mind temple. Remember, it's all about education and learning. But you know, sometimes those people who are all about education and learning, well, they get really lazy. They're so lazy all the time, and they just want to rest on their laurels. Oh, I've learned enough. I don't have to learn anymore, right? And it's usually ESTJs and INFPs who have that perspective. And that's why they have the deadly sin of sloth. They have the deadly sin of sloth. They can be really lazy. And then, because they're lazy, they make sure that anyone that's potentially outperforming their laziness also is forced and has no choice but to be lazy as well, because they don't want to look lazy. They don't want to look like they're underperforming, so they force everyone around them to underperform in order to hide that fact. Yay! Oh, isn't that just fantastic? But yeah, they're pretty lazy. You know, sometimes they get to a point in their life where, like, you literally can hear an ESTJ or an INFP throw their hands up and be like, I have arrived. And when you ever hear that, it's like, okay, nice deadly sin of sloth, bro. Very nice. It happens all the time. And then you have the ENFJ and the ISTP, which has the obvious deadly sin of pride, because no one is more of a know-it-all than they are. Oh my god, my father, he's an ENFJ, and he is the biggest know-it-all I have ever met. He even has the reputation of being the biggest know-it-all I have ever met, to the point where it's actually harmed my family reputation. It's so bad. His TE demon reputation becoming my family reputation because he is a know-it-all. And he's like, he loves when everyone comes to him and asks him what he thinks, even though he's all about sharing what he thinks, and he will not listen to anybody else because it's all about that pride. And guess what? ISTPs have a very similar problem. They're super prideful, because if they didn't think it, it must not be real. Great. Just fantastic. And the living virtue here is obviously humility. Obviously. Where they can actually admit to themselves, yeah, I probably don't know. Or anything can happen. Or like, yeah, we're not really actually sure about that. And that's why philosophers exist, because philosophers really get to those ENFJs and those ISTPs and help them understand that, yeah, they don't really actually know all those things. It's kind of interesting to have that oppositional conflict within the mind temple, because the ESTJ and the INFP are often in the face of ENFJs and ISTPs, even though the ESTJ and the INFP, they themselves have that same pride within, even though also the ENFJs and ISTPs are also pretty lazy. And guess what? My dad is super lazy. Do you think he actually read any of the red pill books I bought him? No, he didn't, because, you know, he's a know-it-all. You know, yippee skippy. And then the body temple, the final temple, ENTJ, ISFP, their deadly sin is greed, which, okay, yeah, again, matches season 7, but they're pretty greedy. They're like, ISFPs are insanely greedy, and they use their ESFJ shadow, where it's like, oh, hey, I'm going to do this nice thing for you, but it always has strings attached because they're using their ESFJ shadow to covert contract you. It's like, what? Really? We're going to be talking about covert contracts a lot within the body temple, because covert contracts exist and live in the body temple more than anywhere else. And that's partly because of greed, but it's also because of the ESFJ INTP deadly sin, which is gluttony. Oh my goodness, my sister getting a bag of chips and watching all of Breaking Bad, or binging, like she binges like nobody else. My sister is Miss ESFJ binger, and she'll like, what I literally buy her for her birthday every year is like a TV show. I buy her like a TV show, like it's got all the episodes in it, so that she can binge, because that's all she wants to do is just binge. And her physical figure very much represents how much she binges things. She loves her some binging. But guess what? This is why, INTPs have the meme, or the judgment, the collective judgment attached to them, that they're literally that nerd in their mother's basement playing video games all day because of gluttony. They are gluttonous, and that's why ESFJs and INTPs, out of all of the 16 types, are typically the fattest and the most obese, because they just can't get past their greed and their gluttony. And combining greed and gluttony, it gets crazy. Now, naturally, the living virtue for greed is charity. And I know that, in season 7, we're talking about virtue and vice, that ENFPs have to learn how to be charitable. I would actually say that this living virtue is not really actually charity. I think it's, because we're just doing opposites, from a dictionary point of view, I think it's closer to generosity, actually. In fact, I actually had the opportunity with John Bodine last night to meet a man by the name of Walter. Walter is an ISFP, and he bought us rum and cokes just randomly. He's never even met us before, but that is him being generous. It really wasn't a charitable move. It was literal generosity, and it was so amazing to see this ISFP dude in a random bar literally living out his living virtue. It's kind of interesting, though, that he had to be drunk to do that, but regardless, he was a solid dude, and I enjoyed smoking a cigar while having a rum and coke with this fantastic ISFP who told me all about his career of tree climbing. He literally climbs trees for a living. And of course, the ISFP would be the one to do that. You know what I'm saying? And of course, he's pulling out his wall. He's got all his money. He even has people coming up to him, putting money in his pocket, etc. And he's all feeling so good about himself because his TE inferior is like, oh, look at me, I look good. Because of his greed, deadly sin at the same time. But then at the same time, he's like, oh, I don't want to look so greedy, so I'm going to buy these guys some drinks and so I can come off generous, etc. And I'm like, yeah, I see what you did there, Mr. Walter. Yeah, but it was fun. It was fun, though. So shout out to Walter, the ISFP. Thank you for demonstrating your living virtue to John and I last night at the bar. It was exquisite and a great experience to actually see that. Fantastic. Good, sir. So, yeah. And then, obviously, the deadly sin for ESFJ INTP is gluttony, and the living virtue is temperance. They have to literally use self-discipline to stop binging and stop being slaves to dopamine. INTPs have it even worse when it comes to dopamine because they can really have a hard time getting out of it because SI child is optimistic. ESFJs can get out of it easier because their SI parent is pessimistic, and will eventually become responsible. Even though my sister she's very obese right now, I have a feeling that, in a couple of years, especially as a woman when she hits development phase around 36, 37 years of age, she is going to transform herself like she has never done before in her life, and she's going to heavily engage in temperance. I absolutely see it coming with her. I'm very excited for her to take control of her health and stop binging and being that couch potato of watching her shows. I mean, it's funny because, I literally see my sister being that 55, 56-year-old woman who's binging romance novels consistently. That's literally my sister consuming female pornography and while chomping down on her potato chips. But, hey, I hope she has a good development phase, reads Eat, Pray, Love like they all do, and then as a result of that decides to actually, lose body fat and become a bombshell that her ISFP husband actually deserves. Yeah, that would be nice. while he's also struggling with his own deadly sin of greed and learning to be generous. Which he kind of was a little generous towards me recently, but I'm always like watching out for that body temple because they love to have their little strings attached, because you never know if there's a covert contract that's attached, so you always got to be aware of that. You know what I'm saying? That's always a risk. So yeah, it's definitely a really, really big deal. So yeah, so in general, that's a good overview of what the deadly sins are, which types are attached to them, what the living virtues are, etc. Just to give you guys a nice little foundation, but we're going to be going deep into each of these, each of the temples, their deadly sins, the living virtues, specific examples, as well as some anecdotes in future episodes. And then we're also going to be talking about something called the 4 transgressions, which is something, I mean, we were initially planning to do that for this episode, but I honestly maintain it needs to be put into an entirely separate episode. And I think it's going to be episode 18, where we talk about the 4 transgressions, which provides a frame of understanding, a lens with which you can look at to consider the deadly sins. Because while it's important to see the deadly sins, they have additional problems, and it's basically because humans have tendencies towards extremes, and the reason why that is because ultimately human behavior, from a behavioral psychology point of view, is still like at a base level based on personal preference, and like I said, we're talking about functional virtues for each of the temples themselves. The soul temple being character, the heart temple being passion, the mind temple being learning, and the body temple being legacy. Those are the functional virtues, but people have preferences on how they aspire towards those functional virtues, and those preferences can cause a negative or a positive expression of those functional virtues. So we're actually going to be discussing how that actually takes place in the next episode, when we're going to be going over the 4 transgressions, and where we're going to be talking about transgressions against the soul, against the heart, against the mind, against the body, and kind of how that works, and then moving forward from there. So, but yeah, I think overall, this part 2 to season 7 will provide additional clarity as to some of the confusion that was kind of left over in the first half of season 7 and the first 16 episodes. But yeah, these next 10 episodes, I think, will be something where we will have the understanding necessary, that little foundation poured, so that we can actually understand, where the Enneagram is currently flawed, because probably talk about in the final episode. Maybe I'll make an 11th episode for that, talking about how the Enneagram is actually flawed, and then the direction that we're going. Because if you really think about it, the Enneagram's entire purpose is really just to discuss or identify a person's cognitive focus. That's all it's for. That's really the only reason it exists. You still have to know a person's type. You still have to know their nature. But like, what subvariant of that nature are they actually? And this is one of the areas that I actually highly disagree with Dave Powers on with objective personality, because OPS as a system, while they are aware of a bunch of subvariants, and I appreciate those subvariants, and it's very based on individual cognitive functions with all the potential 512 combinations of cognitive functions as to which function could be active when. This is where OPS as a system actually falls short, because it's really hyper aware of the microcosms when it comes to Jungian analytical psychology, or how the mind works at a micro level, but it completely ignores the necessary macro understanding of Jungian analytical psychology. And that's why we are going out of our way to make sure that we're getting everyone educated with that understanding. That way, when we release our version of the Enneagram, at that point, everyone will be like, oh yeah, okay, this is where cognitive focus is coming from. This is how it actually intrinsically works. This is how we can identify it. This is how we can benefit from it. Or, hey, this is how we can actually type people knowing these things as well. You don't necessarily have to know, just because, if you know someone's deadly sin, for sure, and yeah, that is absolutely their deadly sin. If you know what their deadly sin is, you've just eliminated 14 of the 16 types. So it really actually helps you navigate the type grid in a way that you've never been able to before. Whereas if you knew their quadra or their house, you've eliminated 12 of the 16. But, there's all these additional vectors that we're adding to the type grid to help you folks actually navigate it to make your typing of people faster and more accurate all the time. So, and this is one of the ways that we're doing it. And I'm glad that we have you journeymen, you acolytes out there who are actually committed to going on this journey with us and really helping us develop Jungian analytical psychology and move it even forward for the benefit of the human race. Hopefully we can promote, especially when it comes to four sides dynamics and the temple theory of Jungian analytical psychology, we can promote a fundamental universal understanding of humanity and the mind and behavioral psychology here on the planet, so that everyone can understand each other, so everyone can forgive each other, and eventually everyone can love each other, because then all of a sudden, we actually would be united as a race for once, instead of divided, and then as a result we can guarantee that we'll always have a bright future for us and our children. So anyway, folks, that's it for Season 7, Episode 17. Thanks for watching. Thank you. We couldn't do it without you. We love you dearly. So thank you, thank you, thank you. With all that being said, folks, I'll see you guys tonight.